Reform of the United Nations Security Council encompasses 5 key issues: categories of membership, the question of the veto held by the 5 permanent members, regional representation, the size of an enlarged council and its working methods, and the Security Council General Assembly relationship. Member states, regional groups and other member state interest groupings develop different positions and proposals on how to move forward on this contested issue. Any reform of the Security Council would require the agreement of at least 2/3 of UN member states, and that of all the permanent members of the UNSC enjoying the veto right. History: even though the geopolitical realities have changed drastically since 1945, when the setup of the current council was decided, the Security Council has changed very little during this long period. The victors of World War II shaped the United Nations Charter in their national interests, dividing the permanent seats, and associated veto power, among themselves. Any reform to the Security Council would require an amendment to the Charter. According to Article 108 of the Charter, amendments to the present Charter shall come into force for all members of the United Nations when they have been adopted by a vote of 2/3 of the members of the General Assembly and ratified in accordance with their respective constitutional processes by 2/3 of the members of the United Nations, including all the permanent members of the Security Council. With the enlargement of the United Nations membership and increasing self-confidence among the new members, going hand in hand with processes of decolonization, old structures and procedures were increasingly challenged. The imbalance between the number of seats in the Security Council and the total number of member states became evident, and the only significant reform of the Security Council came to pass in 1965. The reform included an increase of the non-permanent membership from 6 to 10 members. With Boutros Ghali elected as Secretary-General in 1992, the reform discussions of the UN Security Council were launched again as he started his new term with the first-ever summit of the Security Council and thereafter published an agenda for peace. His motivation was to restructure the composition and anachronistic procedures of the UN organ recognizing the changed world. By 1992, Japan and Germany had become the second and third largest financial contributors to the United Nations and started to demand a permanent seat. Also Brazil and India as the most powerful countries within their regional groups and key players within their regions saw themselves with a permanent seat. This group of 4 countries formed an interest group later known as the G4. On the other hand, their regional rivals were opposed to the G4 becoming permanent members with a veto power. They favored the expansion of the non-permanent category of seats with members to be elected on a regional basis. Italy, Pakistan, Mexico and Egypt started to form an interest group, known as the Coffee Club, and later uniting for consensus. Simultaneously, the African groups started to demand 2 permanent seats for themselves, on the basis of historical injustices and the fact that a large part of the Council unregistered trademark's agenda is concentrated on the continent. Those 2 seats would be permanent African seats, that rotate between African countries chosen by the African group. The existing permanent members, each holding the right of veto on Security Council reform, announced their positions reluctantly. The United States supported the permanent membership of Japan and India and a small number of additional non-permanent members. The United Kingdom and France essentially supported the G4 position, with the expansion of permanent and non-permanent members and the accession of Germany, Brazil, India and Japan to permanent member status, as well as an increased the presence by African countries on the Council. China supported the stronger representation of developing countries, voicing support for India. Russia, India's longtime friend and ally, has also endorsed the fast-growing power's candidature to assume a seat of a permanent member on the Security Council. General Assembly Task Force. The General Assembly Task Force on Security Council reform has delivered a report recommending a compromise solution for entering into governmental negotiations on reform. The report builds on existing transitional intermediary approaches to suggest a timeline perspective. The timeline perspective suggests that member states begin by identifying the negotiables to be included in short-term intergovernmental negotiations. Crucial to the timeline perspective is the scheduling of a mandatory review conference, a forum for discussing changes to any reforms achieved in the near term, and for revisiting negotiables that cannot be agreed upon now. Draft resolution for expansion of Council. At a meeting held on September 14, 2015, nearly 200 member countries of the United Nations have agreed that over the next year, they will negotiate the wording of a document that will call for reforming the Security Council, the top decision-making body, which has 15 members. For the first time, different countries have submitted written suggestions for what the resolution should state in what was seen as an attempt to thwart Security Council's expansion bid. The US, China and Russia did not participate in that exercise. China has been strongly opposing the expansion of the Security Council. It reportedly wanted to force a vote on whether the UN should proceed with a one-year discussion on how the reform should be framed, but failed to muster enough support. The draft resolution calls for next year's UN agenda to discuss the question of equitable representation on and increase in the membership of the Security Council. Once the draft is agreed on, it will be put to vote at the General Assembly, where a two-thirds vote is needed to clear it. Increasing membership. 2005 Annan Plan. On March 21, 2005, the then UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan called on the UN to reach a consensus on expanding the Council to 24 members, in a plan referred to as Enlarger Freedom. He gave two alternatives for implementation, but did not specify which proposal he preferred. The two options mentioned by Annan are referred to as Plan A and Plan B. Plan A calls for creating 6 new permanent members, plus 3 new non-permanent members for a total of 24 seats in the Council. Plan B calls for creating 8 new seats in a new class of members, who would serve for 4 years, subject to renewal, plus 1 non-permanent seat, also for a total of 24. In any case, Annan favored making the decision quickly, stating, "This important issue has been discussed for too long. I believe member states should agree to take a decision on ETA preferably by consensus, but in any case before the summit making use of one or other of the options presented in the report of the high-level panel." The summit mentioned by Annan is the September 2005 Millennium Plus 5 Summit, a high-level plenary meeting that reviewed Annan's report, the implementation of the 2000 Millennium Declaration, and other UN reform-related issues. Uniting for consensus. On July 26, 2005, 5 UN member countries, Italy, Argentina, Canada, Colombia and Pakistan, representing a larger group of countries called Uniting for Consensus, proposed to the General Assembly another project that maintains 5 permanent members and raises the number of non-permanent members to 20. On May 2011, 120 UN member states participated in a Uniting for Consensus meeting in Rome. New permanent member proposals. 1 proposed changes to admit more permanent members. The candidates usually mentioned are Brazil, Germany, India, and Japan. They comprise the group of G4 nations, mutually supporting one another's bids for permanent seats. The United Kingdom, France and Russia support G4 membership in the UN Security Council. This sort of reform has traditionally been opposed by Uniting for Consensus Group, which is composed primarily of nations who are regional rivals and economic competitors of the G4. The group is led by Italy and Spain, Mexico, Colombia, and Argentina, Pakistan, and South Korea, in addition to Turkey, Indonesia and others. Since 1992, Italy and other members of the group have instead proposed semi-permanent seats or the expansion of the number of temporary seats. Most of the leading candidates for permanent membership are regularly elected onto the Security Council by their respective groups. Japan was elected for 11 two-year terms, Brazil for 10 terms, and Germany for 3 terms. India has been elected to the Council 7 times in total, with the most recent successful bid being in 2010 after a gap of almost 20 years since 1991 92. As of 2013, the current P5 members of the Security Council, along with the G4, account for 8 of the world's 10 largest defense budgets, according to SIPRI. They also account for 9 of the 10 largest economies by both nominal GDP and purchasing power parity GDP. Brazil Brazil is the largest country in Latin America in terms of population, GDP and land area. It has the 5th largest population, 7th largest GDP, 11th largest defense budget, and has the 5th largest land area. It is one of only 5 countries that ranks among the top 10 globally in terms of physical size, population, and GDP. The others being the United States, Russia, the People's Republic of China, and India, all permanent members of the UNSC except for India, which is in G4. Furthermore, with Africa and Oceania, South America is one of 3 inhabited continents without permanent representation on the Security Council. Brazil has been elected 10 times to the Security Council. It has contributed troops to UN peacekeeping efforts in the Middle East, the former Belgian Congo, Cyprus, Mozambique, Angola, and more recently East Timor and Haiti. Brazil is one of the main contributors to the UN regular budget. Prior to the UN's founding in 1946, Franklin D. Roosevelt lobbied for Brazil to be included on the Security Council, but the UK and the Soviet Union refused. The United States sent strong indications to Brazil that it was willing to support its membership, albeit without a veto. In June 2011, the Council on Foreign Relations recommended that the U.S. government fully endorse the inclusion of Brazil as a permanent member of the Security Council. Brazil has received backing from other permanent members, Russia, the United Kingdom and France, and from the Community of Portuguese-language countries, Chile, Indonesia, Finland, Slovenia, Australia, South Africa, Guatemala, Vietnam and the Philippines, as well as from the other G4 nations, who mutually support each other. The greatest impediments to its candidacy are the regional oppositions of both Mexico and Argentina, 2 important countries in Latin America. Germany Germany is the 3rd largest contributor to the UN regular budgets next to Japan, and as such, argues for a permanent Security Council seat. Germany has been elected to the Security Council as a non-permanent member 3 times as a unified state, as well as 3 times when it was divided. France has explicitly called for a permanent seat in the UN for its close EU partner. Germany's engagement, its ranking as a great power, its international influence. France would like to see them recognized with a permanent seat on the Security Council, French President Jacques Chirac said in a speech in Berlin in 2000. The former German Chancellor, Gerhard Schröder, also identified Russia, among other countries, as a country that backed Germany's bid. Former President Fidel V. Ramos of the Philippines also expressed his country's support for Germany's bid, together with Japan's. Italy and Netherlands, on the contrary, suggest a common European Union seat in the Council instead of Germany becoming the 3rd European member next to France and the UK. The former German Foreign Minister Joschka Fischer said that Germany would also accept a common European seat, but as long as there is little sign that France and the UK will give up their own seats, Germany should also have a seat. The German campaign for a permanent seat was intensified in 2004. Schröder made himself perfectly clear in August 2004, Germany has the right to a seat. Its bid is supported by Japan, India, Brazil, France, the United Kingdom and Russia, among other countries. Current German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who had initially been quiet on the issue, restated Germany's bid in her address to the UN General Assembly in September 2007. In July 2011, Merkel's trip to Kenya, Angola, and Nigeria was thought to be motivated, in part, by the goal of seeking support from African countries for Germany's bid for a permanent seat on the Security Council. India India, which joined the UN in 1945, 2 years before independence in 1947, is the 2nd largest and one of the largest constant contributors of troops to the United Nations peacekeeping missions. Foreign Policy magazine states that, India's international identity has long been shaped by its role in UN peacekeeping, with more than 100,000 Indian troops having served in UN missions during the past 50 years. Today, India has over 8,500 peacekeepers in the field, more than twice as many as the UN's 5 big powers combined. In supporting India's bid for a permanent seat on an enlarged Security Council last November, U.S. President Barack Obama cited India's long history as a leading contributor to United Nations peacekeeping mission. India has been elected 7 times to the UN Security Council. Most recently India was elected to serve in UNSC from 2011 to 2012 as it had received 188 of the 190 total votes. The country currently has the world's second largest population and is the world's largest liberal democracy. It is also the world's 7th largest economy by nominal GDP and 3rd largest by purchasing power parity. Currently, India maintains the world's 3rd largest active armed force after United States and China and is a nuclear weapon state. The Indian Space Research Organisation is capable of placing satellites in orbit, using indigenous launch vehicles and also succeeded in sending mission to Moon and to Mars. The International Herald Tribune has stated, clearly, a seat for India would make the body more representative and democratic. With India as a member, the Council would be a more legitimate and thus a more effective body. Thomas Friedman of the New York Times, said, "Sometimes I wish that the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council could be chosen with a vote by the fans. Then the Perm 5 would be Russia, China, India, Britain and the United States. FTA Euro unregistered trademark S more like it. India is the world a Euro unregistered trademark S biggest democracy, the world's largest Hindu nation and the world's 2nd largest Muslim nation. India's bid for permanent member of UNSC is backed by permanent members namely France, Russia, the United Kingdom and United States, although the United States initially opposed India's candidacy on grounds of nuclear proliferation, as India has acquired nuclear weapons and not signed the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. On April 15, 2011, the People's Republic of China officially expressed its support for an increased Indian role at the United Nations, without explicitly endorsing India's Security Council ambitions. However, recently China has expressed its support for Indian candidacy as a permanent member of the Security Council if India revoked its support for Japanese candidacy. Countries that explicitly and openly support India for UNSC permanent seat are Armenia, Australia, Bahamas, Bahrain, Bangladesh, Belarus, Belgium, Belize, Benin, Bolivia, Brunei, Bulgaria, Cambodia, Chile, Croatia, Cuba, Cyprus, Czech Republic, Denmark, Dominican Republic, Ethiopia, Finland, Ghana, Guyana, Hungary, Iceland, Israel, Jamaica, Laos, Lesotho, Liberia, Libya, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Malawi, Malaysia, Maldives, Micronesia, Mongolia, Morocco, Myanmar, Nigeria, Norway, Oman, Palay, Peru, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Rwanda, Qatar, Senegal, Singapore, Slovakia, Suriname, Swaziland, Syria, Tajikistan, Tanzania, Trinidad and Tobago, Tuvalu, Ukraine, the United Arab Emirates, Uzbekistan, Vietnam, Zambia, and latest is Sweden as a whole. The African Union also supports India's candidacy for permanent member of UNSC. Japan Japan, which joined the UN in 1956, is the 2nd largest contributor to the UN's regular budget. Its payments had surpassed the sum of those of the United Kingdom, France, China and Russia combined for nearly 2 decades before 2010. Japan has been one of the largest official development assistance donor countries. Thus, Japan, along with India, are considered the most likely candidates for 2 of the new permanent seats. China has stated that it was ready to support India's move for a permanent seat on the UNSC if India did not associate its bid with Japan. This may be contrary to the Indian stand since Japan and India are both members of the G4 and support each other's candidature. Japan has been elected to the Security Council for 11 terms as a non-permanent member. While U.S. Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, speaking at Sophia University in Tokyo, said, "Japan has earned its honorable place among the nations of the world by its own effort and its own character." That's why the United States unambiguously supports a permanent seat for Japan on the United Nations Security Council. Her predecessor, Colin Powell, had objected to Japanese permanent membership because Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution forbids the country from going to war unless in self-defense. Some other Asian nations have expressed support for Japan's application, including Mongolia, Thailand, Cambodia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Bangladesh, the Philippines, and Vietnam are all major recipients of loan and/or foreign investment from Japan. The other G4 countries, Germany, Brazil, and India, who are also bidding for Security Council seats, along with France and the United Kingdom, also back Japan's bid. Australia, the Cook Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, Fiji, Kiribati, the Marshall Islands, Nauru, New Zealand, Niue, Palau, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, the Solomon Islands, Tonga, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu support Japan since Japan agreed to increase financial aid to the region, even though some of these countries are very concerned with Japanese whaling in the region. For instance, Katsuyuki Kawai, then Secretary for Foreign Affairs, member of the Japanese Parliament, and Special Envoy to Nepal, was sent to Kathmandu to lobby for the Nepalese government support for Japanese membership in the UNSC. Kawai met with King Gyanendra and told the press, "If Japan loses its bid this time, Japanese people will think the support Japan has been providing to the world for the last 60 years has been futile." Japan donates significantly to Nepal. Membership based on religion. In June 2005, the foreign ministers of the Organization of the Islamic Conference called for a permanent Muslim seat on the UN Security Council. Recent resistance to the reform draft proposals emanating from the G4 states can be attributed in part to this controversial issue. The US and several Western states have objected to any proposal that gives new members any veto powers, and, within the African Union, Egypt has led resistance to a proposal by Nigeria to adopt a version of the G4 proposals that removes the right of veto for new members, and may enable the creation of a reformed council that does not have any permanent members with a predominantly Muslim identity. Another reason given in opposition to the inclusion of an Islamic nation is the religious aspect to which it is linked. Other religious nations might also request to be provided with permanent membership in the name of religion. Nations with large populations of Buddhists, Catholics, Jews and other religions. Africa. It has also been suggested that an African nation be given a seat on the Security Council, with Egypt, Nigeria and South Africa the most likely contenders. Currently, no country in Africa has a permanent seat on the Security Council. Although no one nation from Africa has formally been put forward as a candidate for membership on the Security Council, Algeria, Egypt, Ethiopia, South Africa, and Nigeria are seen as the strongest choices. Algeria has gained a great deal of respect for its neutrality over the years and its great commitment to African development. Egypt has the biggest military on the continent, was one of the founding members of the United Nations and enjoys great influence in Africa and in the Arab world. Ethiopia was also one of the founding members of the United Nations and holds the seat of the African Union Commission. South Africa has the second largest economy on the continent. And Nigeria is the most populous country in Africa, has the continent's largest economy, and is one of the largest contributors of military and civilian personnel to UN peacekeeping missions. Veto reform. The UNSC power of veto is frequently cited as a major problem within the UN. By wielding their veto power, any of the UNSC's 5 permanent members can prevent the adoption of any UNSC draft resolution not to their liking. Even the mere threat of a veto may lead to changes in the text of a resolution, or it being withheld altogether. As a result, the power of veto often prevents the Council from acting to address pressing international issues and affords the P5 great influence within the UN institution as a whole. For example, the Security Council passed no resolutions on most major Cold War conflicts, including the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia, the Vietnam War, and the Soviet-Euro-Afghan War. Resolutions addressing more current problems, such as the conflict between Israel and Palestine and Iran's suspected development of nuclear weapons, are also heavily influenced by the veto, actual or threatened. Additionally, the veto applies to the selection of the UN Secretary-General, as well as any amendments to the UN Charter, giving the P5 great influence over these processes. Discussions on improving the UN's effectiveness and responsiveness to international security threats often include reform of the UNSC veto. Proposals include, limiting the use of the veto to vital national security issues, requiring agreement from multiple states before exercising the veto, and abolishing the veto entirely. However, any reform of the veto will be very difficult. Articles 108 and 109 of the United Nations Charter grant the P5 veto over any amendments to the Charter, requiring them to approve of any modifications to the UNSC veto power that they themselves hold. Overall positions on reforming the Security Council. United States according to a formal statement by the United States Department of State. According to a formal statement by President of the United States Barack Obama in an address to a joint session of the Indian Parliament. United Kingdom and France the United Kingdom and France hold similar views on reform to the United Nations Security Council. According to a formal statement made by 10 Downing Street. Russia as stated by then-President of Russia Dmitry Medvedev at the General Debate of the 64th Session of the United Nations General Assembly. India as per the official website of India's permanent mission to UN. According to a formal statement by then-Prime Minister of India Manmohan Singh at the General Debate of the 59th Session of the United Nations General Assembly. Brazil as stated by then-President of Brazil Luiz Inacio Lula da Silva at the General Debate of the 63rd Session of the United Nations General Assembly. South Africa according to a formal statement by South Africa's International Relations Minister Mate Nkoana Mashibane speaking in the South African Parliament in Cape Town. Portugal as stated by former Prime Minister of Portugal José Copyright Czar Cubed Crates. Lithuania according to a formal statement by Antanas Valianis, former Lithuanian Minister of Foreign Affairs, at the General Debate of the 58th Session of the United Nations. References. Further reading, Hans Carl Paragrafchler, The Voting Procedure in the United Nations Security Council, 1991, ISBN 3-900704-10-4, Hans Carl Paragrafchler, The United Nations and International Democracy. The Quest for UN Reform, 1997, ISBN 3-900704-16-3, Malone, D. and Mohbani, K. The Union Security Council from the Cold War to the 21st Century, UN World Chronicle, March 30, 2004. External links, The Different Projects of Reform, Center for UN Reform, a Independent policy research organization offering documentation and in-depth analysis on ongoing reform processes.